Okay, well, this is a class on what is a DNA centimorgan and why should I care? And I have to give a disclaimer and an explanation here as we get going on this. I am not a genetic biologist. I have never taken a class in biology since high school. My background is in law. I was a trial attorney for 39 years. So I don't even pretend to be an expert. I'm not putting myself up in the expert category. And I guess that's the reason why the title of this is simply a way to see what is the most essential things that we need to know about our DNA testing, besides all of the mountains and clouds of jargon and scientific terminology that's thrown around. As an attorney, I had, as I kind of characterized myself as a trial attorney, because no matter what the subject was, I was one of the people that was chosen to go to trial. And so basically, I represented everything from A to Z, primarily other things than DNA testing or things like that. But the reason is my job as an attorney was to put terms, especially if I was having a trial with a jury. The idea was to put the concepts that I was representing for my clients in the simplest terms that could possibly be done in order to make sure that there was no jargon and there was nothing that would confuse or create a problem with the jury. So that's kind of the approach that I've taken here, is to try to boil this down to as essential as it can possibly be without having to read long descriptions with multi-syllable words that probably need to be defined. So let's move into it. Kind of to give a background so you'll understand where we are and what we've come to, is that from ancient times until quite recently, any relationships between people were thought to be determined by blood. And since I did this presentation, I watched a couple of movies and some stuff on TV, on the series channels, and it's amazing how many times they use the term blood relation, or that we're related by blood. It's just a common way of expressing the fact that you believe that you have someone as a common ancestor has a common ancestor with you. So this whole idea, and the more technical term, the one that is used more commonly, and rather than saying just blood relative, they say there's consanguinity. I can't even say these words. Consanguinity from the sanguineous or common blood. It's still used to describe the kinship between two people who share a common ancestor. Okay, well, obviously not a word that I use. And this can include relationships between siblings, parents, and children, grandparents, grandchildren, as well as more distant relatives like cousins. And basically, if we get out of the Western European mold, where a lot of our genealogical, not the genealogical fact that we are people who are descendants of Europeans, but that genealogy itself and the way that it's done is done based on a Western European model. It's not based in China. It wasn't created in Africa or South America or any place. So the terminology and sometimes the way the relationships are calculated and all of that information is sort of cultural specific to the Western European countries. So from that standpoint, genealogical relationships, if you go back on old family group records or old records or books or things like that go back in time, old documents and things, it was all based on assumption that there was some kind of degree of kinship based on shared blood, that you were the actual mechanism for transfer of genetic information from one person to another was totally unknown. And even in the times that it was known, it was not understood or even applied to humans in a sense. They didn't, somehow or another, it was a long time before people, and probably a lot of people still living, who don't actually believe in DNA and all of that kind of thing. That's just something that people made up. But let me just mention at the beginning that this is a valid scientific and purely completely defensible way of expressing relationships through what we say DNA, rather than the degree of kinship or shared blood. And so here's a classic kinship chart. You may have seen charts that were not quite this elaborate. The problem we have in doing genealogy in the times, let's say, pre-DNA genealogy, is everything that we were doing to establish this vast relationship scheme was based entirely on either tradition or existing historical records. So if I said somebody was my cousin and we were treated as cousins and we considered ourselves to be cousins, then as far as anybody knew and as far as we knew, we were cousins. We didn't have any particular way of immediately determining if we were cousins in any kind of measurable sense. In other words, the fact that they just we called each other cousins was sufficient. Those of us who then kind of evolved genealogy over the past, probably has been more little around 100 years, but not as long as I haven't been doing it that long, but I've watched it actually evolve. It's mostly gone from kind of family tradition things to being more focused, or hopefully more focused, on historical records. But the problem with historical records, obviously, is that genealogically important documents are inaccessible or missing or were never kept. So knowing who or how someone is related to you, except by tradition or how the family has treated this particular type of relationship, could not be any kind of genetic or relationship that was passed on from a common remote ancestor. So, for example, if your uncle's child, who is your cousin, got married and then got a divorce, and your relationship was with the former husband, now what was your relation to our wife? And what would that be to your, how would you be related to that? Now, you would consider both of those to be cousins in some sense because you're the husband of a cousin or whatever. But obviously, one of the two people is, unless it just happens to be someone who is related to you, is most likely not a relative. So you could see that this gets a little bit tangled in with what the culture will recognize and how it all works. And so all of that passes into what's going on online today with genealogy. When you look at the family trees and come up with all of this amazing amount of information that can't be substantiated. In one of my families, in the family search family tree, people routinely add in this person who has a Tanner as a last name and is not even, we don't even know which one they're talking about. The name they use is Pardon Tanner, and they use this person gets stuck in the family all the time. And there's absolutely no historical, documentary, or any evidence that this person is actually a child who would be, one of my ancestors, one of my uncles in the traditional line of way you look into how people are related. It's kind of an interesting thing. Well, we were sitting here And it's also important to understand that if you go back in time, that genealogists, even today in a lot of cultures, do not have the greatest reputation for being accurate, especially those who make money determining that people are heirs or related, because there's a pretty high incentive in a lot of cases to not be quite as forthcoming as you could be. But for a long time now, DNA has been coming, but it's only been the last few years that DNA has become a tremendously big aspect of normal genealogy. That people who were not necessarily, they're like me in biology, they don't have any of that kind of background, but they're now asking us to look at a pile of information based on DNA testing through various DNA testing companies. So this came along, and the question is, how do we actually use it? What do we do with it? Do we ignore it, or do we understand enough of it that we can use it to assist us in making valid, let's call them scientifically verifiable decisions as to who is and who is not a relative? A lot of the news that's come out about genealogy and DNA has fallen into two different categories. One is what we call the forensic genealogy or forensic DNA, where they're using DNA to solve criminal cases. So if you're a fan of mysteries on the web or wherever you're getting your mysteries this time, you'll know that it's common practice now is to get DNA tests from people, and there's huge DNA databases online, and a lot of criminal things are solved by DNA testing. On the other hand, from the other part of DNA testing that seems to have the greatest impact on what people hear about in DNA testing is when someone finds out that they're not related to the family that they think they are related to. In other words, you're raised in a family and for all intents and purposes believe that you had a genetic relationship with your parents and find out that you don't, and you don't even know who your parents are because you're not related to your parents. This is very common. I run into people who have related this to me over and over again. My wife had a situation where they ended up with 3 new first cousins, and they didn't know that they existed because when they took DNA testing, they found out that the father that they think they had was not the father that they traditionally believed. Beginning in the 1860s, in case you wonder how long this has been going on, DNA actually, the idea of passing on traits, genetic traits, and being able to calculate relationships from a test that would determine the amount of shared DNA starts back in the 1860s. And there was a Swiss chemist named Friedrich Meister that was the one that discovered the idea that there was this chemical process that was what was determining whether or not a certain trait was passed on from the parents to a child. Actually, the whole structure was not understood, and the use of it in the way that it's now being used in genealogy and in forensics and all the other things was only this back in the 1950s. And the double helix that is kind of the symbol of DNA testing now and DNA everywhere was discovered by a lady by the name of Rosalind Franklin. And then 2 of the people who worked with her, James Watson and Francis Crick, took her ideas and published them as their own and forgot to give her any credit, and they got a Nobel Prize. Later, they found out all this information, and there has been some recognition of Rosalind Franklin, but you can still read things that don't give her any attribution at all about the discovery of the double helix in DNA, the structure, actual structure. So why was the structure important? The structure was important because when you found out what the structure was, you could see how any 2 different people were related in the sense that You identified every little tiny piece in the structure, and that was called describing the entire genome, meaning the whole genetic structure of an individual. And when the computers came along and a lot of this information, and it was able to work with huge amounts of information, identifying the structure, the actual every single little link in the DNA double helix for human beings was finally done. So that only happened from the Human Genome Project back in 2003. So it's only been 20 years or so since they had the information that made it possible to accurately determine the true genetic difference between two people. So if you just think of it in kind of abstract terms, and you think, well, okay, what makes you a human being is this huge, long, complex chain of little pieces of information. And when you compare two databases of information, there are slight differences between the two, and the size or nature of those differences determine how closely you are related. And why is that? Well, because of this thing. So what happens is, and this is kind of the part of the terminology that is really necessary, the core terminology. So what happens is we have what's called the genome. That's the entire set of the DNA instructions found in a cell. If you think of it in terms of that twisty double helix, that's a description of all the little links and pieces that make up those little links. In humans, the genome consists of 23 pairs of chromosomes. Okay, those are the little building blocks in there. And there's another one, a smaller chromosome in what's called the mitochondria. It's another part of the cell. Okay, so is this all necessary? Do I have to memorize this, and will there be a test? The answer is, for a genealogical standpoint, what you need to know is the information that shows you this relationship. To learn all of the technology and understand the biology involved can be more helpful when you get into really technical discussions about whether or not this particular structure, the matching that comes about, whether that is valid in a very small amount, and they get in arguing. Okay, well, it can get very technical. But as far as understanding what to use when you go get a DNA test, most of that really doesn't matter, because you're going to get some information back from the DNA testing company. And if you use one of the big companies that does a lot of genealogy, as with Ancestry and MyHeritage, you'll get a ton of information telling you how they have calculated and what they have done. So the question is, can you rely on that information? And then I can use a judgment call from the fact that I spent my life being a trial attorney, and I can say, well, it looks like to me, from what I've had explained to me and from what I can see from the test, that it is accurate, but it's not conclusive, only in certain circumstances. Now, what's the difference here? What is the other key that's missing so far in what I've said? Well, the key that's missing, and from what I've said so far, is that getting a DNA test doesn't do anything for you unless you have a family tree, unless you've done the genealogical research. So, for example, I can take a DNA test and they can send me and say, here's this person that matches you on their DNA test, and you have a match with this person. If I don't know who that person is, the only way that I can figure out how I'm related to that person is to have a family tree on a program where he and I or she and I show up with a common ancestor. So DNA isn't, except in the very, very close relationship, like immediate family members and maybe grandparents, there isn't really anything that you're going to learn from a DNA test unless you have spent a considerable amount of time actually building a family tree. So having one of the programs, and since there's only two of them, and I'll mention that again later, that have extensive family trees and extensive documentary resources and the DNA testing that will help you, then basically, unless you have a family tree on Ancestry or on MyHeritage and take a DNA test, then you're really not going to get a lot of value out of taking a DNA test. Now, what other values are there? You can look for genetic diseases. You can obviously identify anyone else who's taken a DNA test with the same company. And those are the kinds of things that you can get from the DNA test. But that isn't the one that's involved directly with what we're doing in genealogy. So here is as simple as, and I've struggled a little bit about this, but this is as simple as I can get it down to. A chromosome is a thread-like structure made of DNA. DNA is a chemical. And proteins found in the nucleus of cells that carries genetic information. So the little cells have this carrier of genetic information. And the way it works is humans have 46 of these in each cell, and they're arranged in 23 pairs. And you get half of these chromosomes from the mother and the other half from the father. Now, that's a general rule. And there's a lot of discussion if this is exact 50%, or if it's just sort of more close to 50%, and it could be some overlap. But that's all kind of the discussion that goes on, and whether or not that's particularly true. And that may or may not be the case. And there are some instances where that's the problem. But it's something that is close enough to be generally used without any difficulty. A gene is a specific sequence of nucleotides. I'm sorry, I tried to memorize how to say these words and I couldn't. In DNA or RNA, that is usually located on chromosomes. Oh, there's an old statement that goes back when I got to law school, and that was that all that was involved to become a lawyer was learning how to talk like a lawyer. In other words, if you could pick up the jargon of legal jargon, the legal way that the lawyers talk, then basically you could be considered to be a lawyer. Well, that's not strictly true. But I think it's the same thing true with a lot of the genealogist discussion. And I'm sorry I tried it and tried to practice saying some of these terms. Knowing and understanding this information is helpful for using DNA testing results in genealogical research. Okay, that's all you need. That's the basis of what we're saying. If you know at least a little bit of this information, if you know that when you take a DNA test, they analyze the results of the test, and then they go out and compare the test to other people who have taken the same test. And during that process, they come up with a percentage possibility of a relationship between the two people, between those two people that took the test. It may be so attenuated, so far distant that you can't really put a name on the relationship, or it could be as close as a brother, sister, parent. Okay, so this is the core information that's out there, despite the difficulty with the terminology. Now, something else that's really important to understand is that we're talking about an amazingly tiny part of all the genetic information that we have that makes us into a human being. We said every human being on the face of the planet shares about 99.9% of their DNA with everyone else on the planet. There's only this very, very, very small percentage of DNA that distinguishes us between each individual. That's why we don't all look alike, why we have fingerprints that may or may not be unique. There's some studies going on that say they may not be unique as they've been kind of used over the years and things like that. But this is important to understand because we are all related. Everyone is related. And the assumption here is that because of the vast numbers of these genes and the huge number of possibility of putting this together. It's like having a zip code that's, hundreds of digits long. It's not just 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 or whatever. It's a very long process. So it makes everybody unique. And so, with the basis that we're assuming that everyone has a unique DNA, when you see DNA that has patterns that's the same between two DNA tests, then you begin to understand that these people may be related. It's so unlikely that there would be anything shared in this little tiny piece of DNA that's the common one that we can use to look at for distinguishing people. So they take the unique pattern of her DNA and they compare that pattern to other people, and then they have a way of calculating the percentage of possibility that the two people are related. In other words, you have a whole lot of different markers of all these different DNA differences or things that determine who you are as an individual. And when you have groups of these markers or various markers in some order, then they match other people. And when they match other people, the implication is that those two people are related. So we call that sharing DNA. So we don't actually share DNA back and forth, but I guess in a sense we do when we cough and sneeze and stuff like that. That's one way of sharing your DNA with the world, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that the basic structure of the DNA is what determines the uniqueness of the individual. And when we see DNA that looks very similar, then what would happen? Let's say it was similar enough and you had so much shared DNA back and forth that what happened? Well, you'd be an identical twin. And you would look and into some instances you would share a significant portion. But as you move further apart, as you get less and less of the DNA in there that is shared, then you're further apart. And all that's happened here is that they've taken all of this vast amount of information, put it into computers, put it into this genome project where they've identified all of these structures, and then they've taken that information and turned it into a way to give you some kind of information about who your parents are. Now, as I mentioned, this is not made up stuff. This isn't some way to try to make everybody pay money. This is a valid scientific way of determining relationships that has no question. Today in courts of law, DNA is like open shut. If you can prove something through a DNA test, basically you're done. You're not worried about the identity of the person anymore. That's particularly true about identifying an individual from their own DNA, because in that case, it would match. In other words, there wouldn't be significant differences between your DNA at any given time in your life. Okay, so in 2007, only not too long after DNA became a way to, with the Genome Project, it became a way to distinguish between two people. Somebody thought of the idea of using DNA for genealogical purposes to determine your immediate family members and then do research back. Okay. We mentioned that there's some DNA that passed from your parents, both your parents, that you only get 50%. Well, if you trace your paternal line back, your father's line back, or you trace your mother's line back, and you go to mother to mother to mother to mother to mother, and to father to father to father to father to father, what we found is that there's some of those elements of the DNA that are carried down through that line all the way to you. So if you go back just on your father's line or just on your mother's line, then you can determine further back than normal DNA. How far back is DNA reliable? That's the question that's asked commonly. And that would be the first thing I would ask if I were in a lawsuit and getting some kind of cross-examination of a DNA expert. I'd say, well, what can you tell me about the accuracy of DNA testing? And what happens in that case is that there's pretty much a consensus that back about 6 or 7 generations, the percentage of DNA that's shared it almost becomes a random number. And so that doesn't help genealogists with their DNA that goes back much further than that. Now, the good news is that if you want to get really complicated, you can structure DNA tests and you're able to find enough people who are related to you in the right way. If you can structure DNA tests to determine whether or not you're related further back, if you can do that through the male or the female line, and sometimes through other kinds of doing the DNA tests if you get enough of the people in different lines that are matched. And we'll talk about this. I'll show you what happened with one of my cases, one of my ancestors, my great-grandfather. So that was the reason why all these companies started and why they all of a sudden, like Ancestry and Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage and 23andMe and all of these companies got into it real quick, and it became a big thing because of the ability to do this, and it became fairly simple. So you take a DNA test by either a swab or a spit or whatever and get some DNA and you send it in, it's analyzed, and then your test comes back. So you say, well, if you're going to do this, and then you decide if you're going to do more than one test, and you do a test with Ancestry and you do another test with MyHeritage, and guess what? It comes back with different information. All of a sudden, they're telling you that you have this ethnicity thing. Well, what they're doing is and each company does their own estimates there. They're called ethnicity estimates because that's what they are. They're just simply a way of saying that you might fall into this category because we have done this. And as time goes on, these estimates become more and more accurate. And initially, my test, and I did the test with Ancestry and with MyHeritage, the two tests didn't even kind of look very much the same. It was just like, well, yeah, well, I'm taking this DNA, who do I trust? But over time, since I've took the initial tests, even then, I didn't have to be retested, but they keep recalculating everything. And so now, if I look at the two tests, they're very, very, very much the same. There's not any significant difference between them. What they're able to pick up in some cases now is helping, because when you say, well, it's not too accurate going past 6 generations, but if you fall into one of these genetic communities or the smaller communities type groups, then that puts you into a different level of genetic relationship. That means you're related to the group, and that helps you determine about who you are. Okay, so for example, let's get me into some examples here. I have done the research back, and I have 2 of my ancestors, my great-great-grandmother and her sister, who in my culture married the same man, since my relatives going back were polygamous. And both of them been doing the paper genealogy, the research through records and sources, were that they were designated as travelers, which is a euphemism for gypsies or Roma. And we didn't know that. I mean, we knew that was the case, but there was no way to really tell because there's nothing that actually identifies them as that. Now I'm getting a DNA test through Ancestry, and they notify me that I have a certain percentage of Roma ancestors. Well, the only 2 that we could identify that would identify to that are these 2, that we now have 2 ways of knowing that these people very likely had Roma or Gypsy ancestry. Now, Gypsy is not an acceptable term for them. So if you want to get politically correct, they are Roma or Romi. There's two ways of out in the literature that they're recorded. I think Roma is one and Romi is two. That's would be my guess. Okay, so here we are with the question, do you know who you are genetically? Are you related genetically to your immediate family members? Do you know about your genetic family at all? And so the question about that is when you are relying on just paper records of what people said, for instance, census records and things like that, birth certificates and things like that, that may not be accurate. It's not very unusual at all that someone will have a birth certificate that says that these two people are their parents, and it will turn out in a genetic test that one or both of them are not their genetic parents. Why was that the case? Well, it's because when people were adopted, the courts issued new birth certificates showing the adopted parents as the actual parents. And so that's when people are getting into the surprise part of it. I've already mentioned this a couple of times, but you have to take a DNA test to get started with all this. But it doesn't really, and I'm going to repeat this, it doesn't really do you any good unless you have a sourced family tree on a website with a database of other DNA tests and lots of historical records. Because this is a numbers game. And in order for you to have a DNA match, the simple thing is it has to be a match. In other words, the person you're matching to has to have taken the same DNA test that you took. And so if, for example, in my case, I have taken Ancestry and then I have uploaded my raw data from Ancestry into MyHeritage, and now I have Ancestry and MyHeritage information together. And the results of this are in my case, are tens of thousands of potential genetic relatives. So after you take the DNA test is when you need to know about centimorgans. And you thought you would never get to centimorgans, but we did. And now, is there some way of saying this when they talk about centimorgans that doesn't get involved with all of the jargon, all of the terminology that needs to be said? What this is a way of looking at two different genetic DNA strips, two pieces of DNA. And a centimorgan is a 1% unit that measures how likely two pieces of DNA are to be inherited together. So when you take statistical of all the people and all the different DNA tests and how many of this and who turns it out to be, and we know these people are related and such like that, then it's not like a physical distance. It's simply a way of mathematically determining the possibility that different parts of the DNA were preserved in this 50% split, approximately 50% split, when you got 50% from your father and 50% from your mother. And obviously, in each case, that's why your brothers and sisters may not look much like you, because they got a different for 50% from both of their parents. And they got it from different 50% and 50% and 50%. And obviously, if you keep going back with 50% and 50% and 50% and 50%, you get back to why 6 generations gets to the point where it's pretty hard to tell if it's just a random relationship or if it's actually based on the genetic relationship. And core of what you need to know is that the larger the CM or centimorgan percentage, the closer the relationship. So now if we look at some stuff, you'll see what we're talking about. So I'm going to refer to this. This is another website. There are lots of tools out there that are trying to do what I'm doing, and that is to take out the jargon and turn it into some kind of a tool that you can look at and actually get some information without getting involved in a long discussion. And so this is called the DNApainter.com. And it gives you, if you put in these numbers, the centimorgans that they give you when you take a DNA test, then those numbers will show up on this chart. And the ranges show you how kind of vague the whole thing is, because it could be in the high end or at the low end. And then there's space for all the argument in between, which is what you're listening to. If you're listening to an involved discussion between two, really dedicated DNA genealogists who have learned the terminology and speak the language and know exactly what they're talking about if they get in there. So basically, these are the averages. And then there's this disclaimer down here that says, please note that these averages and the actual shared DNA can vary. For example, a range of 575 to 1300 centimorgans could mean the DNA matches a first cousin, a half aunt, or even a grandparent. Well, okay, so here comes the attorney out in me. And so I can sit there and argue with somebody and say, now you've given me taken a DNA test here, and you've said that you're related to this person for inheritance or whatever, but you actually fall within this range. How do we know how you're related if you're could be a first cousin or an aunt, a half aunt, or even a grandparent? Okay, well, it's hard to be a grandparent of yourself, but first of all, this is where it gets into we're not really sure. So here's a results of one of my DNA tests. I get a DNA test and they say they don't know the quality, meaning they're not tracing or giving you information about the reliability of that particular test. They're saying what they got out of it was a 9% or 639 centimorgans, and the shared segments, which is roughly larger, the more the possibility of relationship, and the largest segment is 80 centimorgans. All of this put together is what the analysis is, and all I can say is that the tools they give you now with the companies that give you the DNS do that analysis for you and tell you what all of this results looks like. So from my heritage, for example, so I put that 639 in there. I put in my age. I put in my match's age. And then it looks to the bottom and it says, I have a 47.6% chance that this person is my first cousin and that we are related through grandparents. And then I have the rest of this. And then we're related through a parent, meaning there's one of my parents that is related at this level. So all of these relationships are the same. So even though I know that this person has this relationship to me, I'm not sure where on that big genealogy chart that shows all the various relationships and half relationships and all that, whether or not where they fall on that. And how do we determine that? We determine that with good old documentary-based genealogy. And that's why we need a family tree on a website with the one that takes the DNA test. Now, the DNA matches help solve family mysteries. They do that. It's just the way it works because the companies help you do this kind of relationship, assuming you have done the time and the effort to build your family tree and utilize the records and of various websites and things and original records to determine that. So here's my great-grandfather, Marinus Christensen. He was born in Denmark. The rumor was that he was a adopted person in the family. It appeared that could be the case since he had two sisters who were almost 20 years older than he was. And he was kind of like an only child, and it was kind of illogical that the mother had not had a baby for 20 years. But that, I suppose it could have happened, but there was still no way of knowing he was adopted. We've done exhaustive genealogy on it. meaning looking through the records. The records that I finally found, church records, showed that he was adopted. That's all it said. The question was, who were his parents, who were his adoptive parents, and what was the confirmation that he was adopted, not rather than just a statement, which, by the way, made the descendants of his sisters and his descendants kind of not like each other because of this. They were saying, oh, you're not really, anyway, you know how that goes. So what happened here? Well, okay, really short story. One of my daughters, who's a professional genealogist, searched the town where he was born, which is Torslev in Koring, Denmark, and found somebody who was born at exactly the same time with the name Marinus. Okay, so that may have been that person, but that gets into speculation. Same name, same person doesn't work. In Denmark, the fact they had the same name and were born on the same date is just like nothing, doesn't prove anything at all, or isn't even a very substantial reason for making a conclusion. And what happened? We got the MyHeritage DNA test, and we began to have people matched who were the descendants of that person who my daughter found. Okay, so now we know. Now we know because we have there's no other way that we would be related to these people in Denmark. And that's the only line that we have in common from genealogical research. And so we've identified his birth parents. And by the way, his birth parents were not married, which was probably why he was too. So instead of having Marinus Christensen go through to Jens Christensen, who was the traditional father, his birth father now is Anton Markwarthen, and Kristen Marie Johansson was his mother. Okay. So all of a sudden we have a whole new genealogy line, but it turns out that people have been working on that one for years, and so it wouldn't give us a lot of opportunity. The thing that's important about the genealogy, whether or not you use it to resolve a mystery, is it validates what you're doing in the relationships. Okay. So as you do a genealogy test and it's on Ancestry or MyHeritage, and you've got your family tree on both, you start to see people who are descendants showing up as matches. And that validates the fact that you have the right people in your family tree, or you may all of a sudden decide you don't have the right people because you don't have anybody showing up as a descendant of that person. And there's enough people on both those programs to give you a real good start at this almost around the world because of the numbers of people we're talking about now. So it's important to note that also, this is now the new world. The new world starts about a year and a half ago when everybody decided that there was a thing out there called artificial intelligence. So it's important to note that once you got into the artificial intelligence, the accuracy of this whole process will increase dramatically. And the number of matches and the kinds of things that you can do and the questions you can ask are going to start to make a lot of difference. So as time passes, and I mean like in the next few months and to a year from now, you will probably begin to see some significant results from DNA testing that seem to be kind of remarkable, telling you how you come from a particular ethnic community, and they may be able to identify down to the town where some of your ancestors came from. But if you don't have the family tree, that's not going to help you. So this is kind of the plea to get your family trees worked on. If you go get a DNA test, at least take the time to build a family tree, at least back 6 generations or so that you can match in and know your accuracy on your ancestors, as well as help others find the relationships that helps them to validate their own family trees. Okay.